It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank those of you who interrupted your summer vacation to be with us. Certainly I've had the pleasure of working with the 25 folks this morning, and so we'll continue where we left off. But this is a lecture, so it'll be a little bit different from what my style usually is, which is pretty interactive, but I know this is being taped, so I have to be on my best behavior. But also, I will answer questions at the end, okay? So I wanted you to know that this topic that we're talking about this afternoon is in the context of our work together at the initiative with respect to adolescent literacy and furthering the whole idea of proficiency for adolescents, some of whom struggle, some of whom don't necessarily struggle, but aren't doing as well as they might. And so one of my concerns is that what we're dealing with is some prevailing myths that we have to confront and dispel if we really want to promote literacy acquisition in our secondary schools. And I do have to explain to you my use of the visual here about mermaids. I don't know if you know this, but the myth of the mermaid, they say, was created when sailors had a little too much grog and saw basically what we call in Florida manatees, what they call dugongs in the Pacific coast. They saw these manatees, and they got to be looking pretty good after months at sea. And so that's how the myth of the mermaid, they say, began. So I use these icons to contrast what is the myth versus what the reality needs to be, okay? So that's the way this is organized. One of the prevailing myths relates to language development, that language development is an issue that we just worry about with young kids. You know, we certainly are concerned as parents and grandparents about our little ones engaging in interaction and talking and doing all those good things. And then we send them to school, and, you know, maybe we think language has something to do with their learning in kindergarten and first grade and, maybe even second grade. When you start getting up into the secondary school years, middle, junior, and high school, we do not pay much attention at all to the notion that oral language is a significant enough factor to pay attention to with adolescents. And that, as I say, is a myth. The reality is that we, first of all, one of the realities, there are many realities related to this language development issue, but with specific respect to the oral language component, we sometimes find adolescents who do have oral language difficulties that they mask. And interestingly enough, what they do is they project a very sometimes suave persona of someone who interacts using one-liners, you know, and they are really not very good at using language orally if push came to shove. So they're okay, like with social chit-chat at the basketball game, or, you know, with their friends in the hall, changing books in their lockers and all that sort of thing. But they may actually appear okay. And what teachers often say about these kinds of students is, not only does this kid not have a language problem, but I cannot get him to shut up. Okay? And part of what I call that, this is not written in the research literature, I call that running at the mouth. You know, just to sort of keep on talking. And sometimes I think it's a way to keep people from asking them things that they can't answer. Or because they don't necessarily follow conversations that well, they just keep talking to keep from other people from talking. So that is one kind of situation I think that we have to be aware of, that that there are students who do continue to struggle with oral language well into adolescence, but they mask their problems. Okay? Now, the flip side of this is if we look at the myth that, well, if an adolescent seems to be okay communicating orally, that, you know, we don't see the one-liners and we don't see the running at the mouth kind of thing. He seems fine, so there can't be anything wrong with his language. Well, the problem is the oral language that we use for interaction is not anywhere near as complex as the language we need for academic learning. So even if an adolescent has language for social competence, they may very well have a problem with academic language. The language of the textbooks or the language of the secondary teacher in teaching the content of secondary courses. So that is a very important thing to consider, because as I say, when we start looking at secondary schools, these issues are not necessarily the ones that are discussed by faculty when they're exploring the academic achievement of students. It does not typically occur to secondary folks that language could be a culprit in the academic problems that students are encountering. Okay? And so this whole idea of literacy and kids reading and writing, that really has nothing to do with language. Language is what you deal with orally, and language is what you deal with younger kids, and so it really has nothing to do with reading and writing. Well, this is a big myth, because we look at language processes, and the language processes involved in literacy are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And then if you want to throw in viewing and representing and presenting or whatever terms you want to use to acknowledge the digital age and the things that adolescents have to do with symbolic symbols in terms of comprehension and production, then we can look at that as well. But the idea that we have language processes that we could easily call literacy processes. It's a toss-up whether you want to call them language processes or literacy processes. The bottom line is that they are interrelated, and that you cannot talk about literacy without, in the same breath, using the word language. You just can't. Okay? And so this is a graphic that I use to help convey what I mean. You saw in the other slide, the term I used was language underpinnings. Okay? So let me explain a little bit of where I'm coming from here. We have, for the moment, let's talk about the four major language processes of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Okay? First of all, when I went to school, I'm not going to tell you what year, I learned that these processes developed in a rather linear fashion. That first, kids learned to deal with oral language. That's oral with an O. Oral language. And oral language with an AU. And so listening and speaking were the things that children learned first, okay? And then they learned to read and write. And that oral language provides a foundation for reading and writing. And you're saying to yourself, and so what? That's not true? And my answer is, it's partly true. First of all, it is true that for at least children who hear, and that's a big F, for children, if they hear, oral language is going to be how they acquire language competencies. And yes, it is true that in the beginning stages of acquiring reading and writing, one has to have a base upon which to draw to learn to read and write. You have to have a symbolic system intact in order to read and write that symbolic system. So when I talk about the middle part here, these underpinning things, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the foundational elements that are required for listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And that's what I'm calling the underpinnings. They're the same foundations, albeit acknowledging that the complexity of reading and writing differs from the typical complexity of listening and speaking. Now, what is not the case, and which is one of these myths that we have to dispel, is that these develop in a linear fashion, and that once kids acquire basic competencies in listening and speaking, that's over and done. And they've moved on to bigger and better things in reading. Okay? One of the things you'll note here is I have arrows going all which ways, and that's in recognition to the developmental patterns that are not linear. That one of the things we've learned over the years about the development of listening, speaking, reading, and writing is that there is a reciprocal relationship. That learning in one area, kids who have really good listening skills are more likely to have better reading comprehension skills. Kids who have better speaking skills are likely to be better writers, and then whatever combination, other combination you can describe if you just take a look at these arrows going all which ways, okay? That's the good news portion. The bad news portion is that children who have difficulties early on with oral language are in fact likely to have problems with reading and writing. But what is also true is that students who do not appear early in their childhood to have oral language problems, but who encounter significant difficulties in learning to read and write, will up the road as they become older start to show some difficulties in oral language, especially academic discourse, when they have to converse with their chemistry teacher, when they have to converse with the algebra teacher. So it's not that you're going to tell it in their chit-chat, but in the academic language conversations that they need to have in school, this will start to show the ill effects of problems in this area, in these areas. That's what we term the whole reciprocity of language processes. The good news about this is, and the important instruction / intervention takeaway of this notion of reciprocity is that even if you are very worried about how kids read, how adolescents read, if all you do is pay attention to how they read, you're not going to get the job done. You cannot take any one of these language processes in isolation. They have to be worked together. And we do know, we do have research that substantiates that. As an example, if you know that students have comprehension problems, especially with some higher level expository text, let's say students who really don't understand text that deals with argumentation and persuasion, right? We know that by helping them develop writing skills in argumentation and persuasion, it helps their comprehension. Example, okay? But the whole idea is that because of what we know about this reciprocity, you must take these processes and work with them in an integrated fashion. Now, that's a very, very important construct, okay? And The other piece to this, relative to this middle part, okay, these underpinning things, there are several different categories of them. We would call these things the linguistic system, okay? So, for example, being able to deal with the phonological system of a language means being able to deal with the sound system. So the fact that I can say in English chair means that I have some ability to articulate the phonemes of English, okay? So phonology is the sound system, okay? Morphology is the system of minimal units of meaning, and so the idea of how individual sounds are combined into morphemes, which are, as I say, units of meaning, not always a word, sometimes a syllable, sometimes even a single sound, but their meaning. So, for example, if I say shave, and then I want to say shaved, that's a past tense, that's a morpheme, okay, indicating past tense. Okay? So being able to deal with that whole morphological system of our language, of how we change words to render different meanings, or how we put words together to make different meanings, the use of prefixes, to say construct but then deconstruct, that's all part of morphology, right? And then, of course, we have syntax, which is actually not what you pay in church. Couldn't resist. That's the old, I couldn't resist. I just have to. But syntax is the ability to deal with putting words together into phrases, clauses, and sentences. And to be able to put sentences together into discourses. Okay, discourse is basically a longer string, or text. Discourse and text are synonymous. Again, back in the Dark Ages, when I went to school, we sort of stopped with Chomsky at the sentence level, studying the sentence level. And now we continue with McNamara and Fang and Schleppengrell and lots of others in studying discourse structure. So that's part of syntax, and an important part of syntax when you start looking at adolescents and what adolescents need to be able to do with academic language. Dealing with different discourse structures in disciplines is something that's important. And then, of course, semantics is meaning. All right, so dealing with meaning, which is often affected or interactive with these other abilities, is what kids have to be able to do. Vocabulary is the thing that comes to mind, but there's figurative meanings and denotations and connotations, all that fancy stuff that they have to be able to deal with in semantics. And then pragmatics is the appropriate social use of language. How do you use language in different situations? So from an oral standpoint, does an adolescent know that what he says to his friends is not what he can say to the principal? No, sometimes they don't. And that gets them into trouble. We do have kids who do not know the rules of pragmatics, or, you know, they have a problem in that area. But it's also true that you have to write to a specific audience. So this is not just oral language we're talking about written language as well. So that's what we would call the linguistic underpinnings. So just to give you an example, if I were to say to you, I am so happy to have the opportunity to be with you this afternoon, I am using a combination of my ability in all of these areas. I didn't make any errors in the phonemes I used. I used all the right morphemes. My syntactic structure was fine, and I conveyed meaning, and it was pragmatically appropriate to say that to you, right? Okay. So that's an example of operating at the linguistic level, being able to use language for communication purposes. In this case, it was oral. I could have also written that on a board for you. Other underpinnings, I call these the kissing cousins. That's what we say in the South of the United States, kissing cousins. And related cognitive are the companion pieces that are not linguistic pieces in and of themselves, but they're necessary companions to language. So the idea that in order to be a communicator, whether you're talking about oral or written communication, you have to focus and attend to either a person or a product or a screen. So focus and attention is an important piece. Working memory, storage, retrieval, all of those things. Organization. So there are some cognitive pieces that have to be intact to work to support these processes. In the outer ring, we up the ante. These are the metas. And I'm just going to switch here to this graphic to talk about meta. And in this case, it's metacognition. Okay? And so an example or a definition of metacognition is thinking about thinking. So it's not enough for you to think or be a good thinker. You have to reflect on the way you think, what you've thought, how you go about thinking. And a synonym for this reflection is called awareness. So awareness of your own, and the processes got lost back here, but your own cognitive processes. Your awareness of your cognitive processes would be part of your metacognitive abilities. Kids need metacognitive abilities to engage, especially in higher level language processes. So when we say that to be a proficient reader, an adolescent has to say to himself, am I thinking about this in the right way? Am I understanding what I'm reading? That is a metacognitive process. Unless kids can engage in metacognition, they are not going to be effective language users, especially at higher levels. And that's why I use the mirror icon to just convey that when you reflect, get it? Reflect, mirror, okay. When you reflect on something, you're in meta land, okay? So if we talk about metacognition that way, we also can talk about metalinguistics. And this again is another related set of abilities where we are aware of our own language use, either something we've said, something, or somebody else's language too, something we've read, or something we've written or somebody else has written. So in the sentence I said to you before, if I remember exactly, working memory may not be intact at the moment, but I am very happy to have the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. By just saying that, I am not operating at the metalinguistic level, I'm just operating at the linguistic level. But if I were to turn around and say to you, when I said that sentence, the minute I say sentence, I'm in metaland, because I'm now talking about a unit of linguistic structure. I am happy to be with you. I used two pronouns. I am now analyzing my language. I'm reflecting on it, and I am talking about it. Okay. We know that that combination of metalinguistics and metacognition is what is desperately needed by adolescents to be proficient in literacy. Okay? Now, to bring this home a little bit, I'm going to tell you I'll give you a couple examples ripped from the headlines of my own family. My granddaughter, Amanda, those of you met Amanda earlier, sort of. Amanda is now 15, but when Amanda was 3, Amanda said to me, Nonna, because that's grandma in Italian, Nonna, you are a silly, dilly, willy-nilly. Okay, I was excited. Why was I excited? Yes, she was obviously aware of rhyming patterns enough to play with them. At age 3, I'm pretty excited. My husband, who's also, I'm a speech-language pathologist by original persuasion and preparation, and my husband, who's also a speech-language pathologist, was very excited. My daughter, the first grade teacher, was equally excited. My son, who's in NASCAR, had no clue why we were excited, okay? But that was at age 3. Well, at age 4, one of the things that was a routine for us is that as I would have breakfast, we would play with Play-Doh. And you know, half the time I didn't know whether I was eating Play-Doh or toast. But so I would be playing with Amanda with Play-Doh, and she said to me, Nona, I have a new set of molds to play with the Play-Doh, okay? And so I'd like to, we have animals and we have letters. Let's make animals to go with letters. Oh, I like this game. So I said, well, how are we going to do that, Amanda? She said, I don't know, but I thought you'd know. I said, yeah, I have an idea. How about we do this? How about we get one of the animal molds, and let's say we take the dog. We'll make a dog. And then we'll say to ourselves, dog. When we say dog, what sound is at the beginning of the word dog? That sounds like a D sound. What letter usually makes the D sound? A D. So let's make a D to go with the dog. That'll work, Nona. So we did, she's 4. And this is no lie, this is the truth. And so, you know, we did that about a half hour. At the end of the day, people in the house were drinking wine. I was not. I was drinking beer before my gluten-free days. So said to me, Nona, I know what letter is at the beginning of the word wine. What is a 4-year-old going to say? Why? Yeah. And I said, I like the way you're thinking, and I understand why you said that. Okay? It's actually a W. You know, but that wasn't the issue, is that she was using the process. Okay. This is a story about her progressing metalinguistic abilities. In this case, it was her phonological and phonemic awareness that was being evidenced, okay? When she was 6 is when I actually gave her the name of Miss Meta. One of our traditions is I make birthday cakes for my granddaughters, and you know the Wilton decorating thing where you have the colors up your arm and it's all over the house. And anyway, I only do it for them. But I was waiting for the cake to cool, and she said, Nona, I have an idea. Let's play video games while we're waiting for the cake to cool. That is not Nona's idea of a good time. So I said, well, you know, Amanda, Nona doesn't really know how to play video games. She said, not to worry, Nona, I will teach you. And she's 6, and that is how she talked at age 6. So she's in the throes of teaching me how to play this video game, and she's using her hands. I don't know where she got that from, but she's using her hands to explain to me how to play this video game. And she stops mid-sentence, and she holds up a finger, and she says, you know, Nona, it is a good thing we have words. They help us to know. I wanted to say to her, you know, Vygotsky, eat your heart out, you know, or something profound like that. All I could say was, uh-huh. You know, and so there's an example of she's reflecting on the purpose of language. That it helps us to think. That's a whole new kind of meta, but meta nonetheless. However, one of my favorite ones was when she was 7. She has a little sister who's 4 years younger than she is, and I was with the little sister in the bathtub. She was taking a bath. I wasn't in the bathtub with her. I was watching her, and she was surrounded by toy frogs, a whole bunch of toy frogs. So Amanda passes by the bathroom, looks in, and she says, will you look at that bathtub? It is so frogacious. So there's somebody who knows morphology. There's a 7-year-old who knows how to change word endings to create a different part of speech. Okay? So now, it is true that my granddaughter's gifted, and that we don't necessarily expect that level at those ages, but close, close. We don't have the neat metalinguistic development charts like we have for linguistics. We really don't. We're just sort of starting to do that. But the point, my whole point of this is that when we talk about underpinnings and we talk about those things that are needed for these processes, the metas are extremely important. And without the metas, kids are not going to be proficient literacy users. And a lot of the kids who struggle in adolescence with literacy do not have intact metalinguistic or metacognitive processes. And they're not only kids with disabilities either. These are kids who need to have taught in a more explicit fashion some of these skills, and so, or strategies. The bottom line, which is the good news, is that we can teach these things. We can teach them. But we have to be aware that they need to be taught. And that's my whole point. It's a myth that all of this is irrelevant with adolescents. We don't have to mess with it because it's old history for younger kids and none of this pertains. That is just not the case. Okay? So, moving past this, here's another myth, is that literacy, and this, see, a lot of these myths are interrelated if you think about it, sort of one feeds off the other. And so if, you know, if language is the domain of younger kids and we shouldn't really worry about it in adolescence, then we also can jump, and not even jump, maybe just lean from there to the notion that, well, then kids should be taught how to be literate in elementary school, and what are those teachers in elementary school doing? And so literacy is not the job of secondary educators. It should be handled by the elementary folks. And the problem with that is that we have to share the responsibility. If we look at the data, and we certainly this morning spent some time looking at data about the literacy proficiency in your province and in your country, which is parallel to some of the stats that we have in the States, we should really be worried about what's going on with literacy, and that it's an issue that everyone has to share in dealing with, and so that it's not just a question of kids who struggle, but there is a developmental issue that language continues to develop, and that's one of the things we need to pay attention to. Typically, the kids who are going to have the most trouble acquiring literacy are kids with disabilities, kids of poverty, kids for whom English is a second language, if you're talking about English being the primary language. And so there is a need to address the broad spectrum of literacy issues, and all secondary educators have to be on board. All teachers have to be on board, although with differentiated roles to play. I'm not saying everybody has to do everything, but we have to figure out at a school level who needs to do what in order to create as outcomes the literacy proficiencies that students need in middle, junior, and high school. Now, one of the things that is also a myth, which certainly is one that we have encountered, that it's fruitless to spend time and money on adolescents because, you know, they've already passed the point of no return. You know, let's just take our dollars and put them into early literacy, and that's where the real bang for the buck should be. Okay? Well, what's interesting about that is that There are evidence-based practices that we know work, that we can intervene with adolescents who struggle, and it does pay off. So there is evidence that it is not a waste of money. There's also, and this is something certainly we spent some time this morning talking about, the idea that even if you put a lot of money in early literacy, it's not going to eradicate the need for paying attention to literacy at the secondary level. Because the reality is that some students will not encounter until the curriculum demands escalate in secondary schools. So you can't fix the problem until it exists. I mean, you can prepare kids well, and certainly we don't want to say, oh, you don't have to pay much attention to early literacy. No, we're not saying that. We're just saying that paying attention to early literacy is an important but insufficient by itself approach. That, yes, we need to attend to it, but it is not the alternative to secondary literacy initiatives, which is why I'm very honored to participate in this particular initiative, because it is so important, and there aren't enough people investing time, energy, and resources in trying to address this particular arena. And you know, our society in general is sort of suffering the consequences of the lack of attention. So, you know, we do have practices we know work, and we need to approach it optimistically that given that we follow evidence-based practice, we can make a difference with adolescents and perhaps keep them from dropping out of school, keeping them from going to jail, you know, all of those awful things that happen when kids are in a cycle of failure. Okay? Now, because there has been so much attention to working with younger kids, and because sometimes adolescents look a little, and I say a little, like younger kids in the sense of what they can do and not do, the tendency is to say, oh, okay, well, we can use the same materials, the same programs, the same approaches that work with younger kids because these are kids at the same developmental level. Well, having worked with adolescents most of my career, my immediate response to that is, not unless you want them to hurt you. You know? Also, really, we just don't know that these things work. Some of the things that we do with younger children. And one of the cases in point that we talked briefly about earlier in our group was we do know phonemic awareness is an important piece to the word recognition puzzle. But some of the research that's being done, actually Ginger Berninger in Washington, state of Washington, has done some really interesting work in going more at the morphological level rather than the phonological level in working with adolescents. And so we just can't assume that because a 15-year-old is reading at a second grade level, we're going to take out the second grade level program or materials and try to do it with that student. Okay? So there's a lot more research that needs to be done relative to that. We do have more and more, I'd have to say, over even just the past 5 years, certainly in the past 10 years, we've seen a real spurt of research in adolescent literacy, not nearly enough. And certainly we haven't caught up to the research that has gone on with early literacy, but a lot of that has to do with funding sources for research and where the money is being placed in research. But we really do want to take into consideration what students at the secondary level need to learn and look at what approaches need to be used in tandem with what their demands are that they're facing. Okay? Okay, this is one of my oft-heard statements from secondary teachers, and those are the folks I hang out with the most. They'll tell me, oh, Barb, you know, I can't do anything with this kid. He's just not motivated. Well, is it true that motivation is a deterrent to progress? Well, if your kid lacks it, well, of course. But the point is, and this is the truth is that it's a variable you have to address. It's part of your job. If you know that an adolescent is not motivated in dealing with literacy, you can't just, throw up your hands and say, oh, well, nothing I can do about it. He's not motivated. You've got to figure out how to motivate that adolescent. Not only that, it is a chicken and egg situation. Students, as they get better in reading and writing and listening and speaking, become more motivated, and we do have some significant data that supports that the learning of strategies, especially strategies in reading and writing, enhance students' motivation. So becoming strategic learners actually increases motivation. So my point about this is that the myth we have to dispel is that motivation is a prerequisite. It has to be a co-requisite, but it's a variable we as professionals need to manipulate. We need to help to address motivation by teaching kids what they need to know to be successful and teaching them how to understand that what we're doing is en route to their being more successful. Okay? This idea that we need to focus on basic skills in print, which is the focal point if you look around the universe, and you especially if you look at reading programs, a lot of them are print-based, looking at print and looking at paper. And the idea in this digital literacy age, we really need to move beyond. We need to go beyond the basics to what we call multiple literacies and pay attention to the various frameworks within which kids have to deal with symbolic language and be successful. And the whole idea here is that there's a range and a repertoire of skills and strategies that students need to have, and that we, in our creation of programs for adolescent literacy, have to figure out how much time to spend in what areas. We are just beginning now to start asking some of the questions about effective practices for digital literacy. There's some research that we do have, although certainly not enough, so that we can create a protocol for addressing digital literacy in a way that we can be comfortable, that makes sense. So that's an area where there's a lot more research needed.